Awesome. All right. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Beau Bruneau. As Lena had told you, I am an innovations analyst at Florence Healthcare. And I'm tuning in from Atlanta, Georgia, down in the South. Today's agenda, I'm going to introduce myself, why you should listen to me, and what I have to say. Who are we, Florence Healthcare, and what we do? Because I am an analyst, I might as well give you some insight into where the e-clinical space is today and where it will be tomorrow. And then lastly, the whole point of the talk is, how do you innovate without compromising on regulation compliance? A little bit about me. I just graduated from Georgia Tech just in May. While I was at Georgia Tech, I worked on medical device, a bunch of different medical device product development projects. So worked on a lateral access lumbar spine surgery simulator, skin punch retractable biopsy tool, and a whole bunch of wide variety of medical device topics or projects. I started with Florence as a project management intern in their compliance team last December, and then started with them in June of this year, shortly after graduation, on the innovations team, where I am evaluating different trends in clinical trials and seeing where there are potential opportunities to create some new products. On the bottom is my blog and my LinkedIn. I will tell you a little bit about those at the end. So let me know if you have any questions. I'm just going to move this chat over here. Okay. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about Florence Healthcare. Now you know a little bit about me. So Florence Healthcare, our two founders 7 years ago, realized that there's a room just like this in just about every clinical trial office. Many of you know what this looks like, right? There's patient binders everywhere. There's regulatory binders everywhere, and it's a mess. And some of these rooms are literal warehouses with hundreds and hundreds of these boxes and binders, sometimes even thousands, right? They realized there's an opportunity here to improve on this process. And what they also realized is that anyone else in the space was not focused on clinical trial sites, right? Most of the focus was on sponsors and CROs, where more of the money was. So that eventually what morphed out of, seeing this picture for them was what our products are today. So it started with eBinders, which is the one all the way on the left. This was our eISF platform, right? Which has things like e-signatures, version control, audit trails, role-based access, right? And then what morphed out of that is our eTMF platform and our eHub platforms, which kind of brought on that sponsor and CRO side and created an access bridge for sharing information to those parties. And coming in January, which we're really excited about, is eConsent, which was our most recent innovation. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But that is our first participant-facing application, which we're very excited to see how it does and see what we can do in the e-clinical space. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat. I do tend to talk really quickly. So if I go over anything too fast, just drop them in the chat. All right, so moving on. So the vision of Florence Healthcare is we want to advance clinical trials in order to bring cures to market faster. And so the statement that you're seeing on the presentation right now is how we guide our innovation process, right? So how we want to advance clinical trials is by solving sites' content problem and solving sponsors and CROs access problem. And so this categorizes how we think about product development. When we go into thinking about what the next things that we're going to develop are, we try to go back to this vision to see how that is aligned with our goals. So let's bring some context to some terms. You see engineering innovations, right, on the thing. That's a mouthful, right? So when you think of engineer, you might think of some nerdy dude in a dark basement writing shapes and hieroglyphic calculus, right? And so that is what I think of, right? And that was me for 4 years when I was at Georgia Tech. But the way that I like to think about engineering and the way that I'm now a business analyst, right, is it's really just a framework, right, for how you think about things. So engineering is really just breaking larger problems into smaller components and addressing them individually, systematically, and iteratively, right? And the way I like to think about innovations is actually summed up amazingly in this quote by Brian Halligan, who is the CEO of HubSpot. And he says, innovation, imagine the future and fill in the gaps. And so this ideology is very similar to goal setting, right? Where you have this idealistic goal state, and then all you have to do is work every day towards that goal state, right? And so when we're thinking about innovation that way, it flips the perspective from, okay, I have to develop the next greatest thing in innovation to, no, I have this ideal way that something is going to work. And I just need to make improvements towards that goal every single day, right? And every single product release. So how does this apply to clinical trials, right? What does this really mean when we're trying to engineer innovations, right? And so I did just graduate. Full disclosure, I graduated I guess 6 months ago now. And so you might be thinking, wow, what does this guy know about clinical trials, right? And like, why should I be listening to him? And something that I think I bring to the table is a fresh perspective on clinical trials. I mean, I've been in healthcare for 5 years now, working in engineering and medical device development, or learning about it. And so what I bring to clinical trials is that fresh perspective on, how can we do things a little bit differently, or look at it in a fresh perspective with an ode to the people who have been here for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? And utilize the information that we can get from them to build products that are going to help us in the future. So in clinical trials, what we did was we started to look at, this is the original idea of the bigger picture, right? Breaking down all of breaking down the whole picture. So it started with the two parties, right? The sponsor and the coordinating site or the center, right? And what's the relationship between them? What are the things that are shared between those things? And so now you can add all of these other parties that are involved within clinical research. You may have the local clinic or local labs. You have nurses that are going and doing home health visits, right? And so when you start drawing out the bigger picture, it then brings up a lot of questions, right? So what is being shared between these different parties in these different lines, these different relationships? What's being shared between them? What responsibilities are being owned by which party? How do participants in clinical trials fit within this picture? Who are they communicating with? And what processes within all of these relationships need to be improved in order to advance clinical trials? So that's taking the big picture, trying to break it down into smaller components, fitting it with our vision statement of solving sites content problem and sponsors access problem. And that's how we begin that brainstorming innovations process at Florence. And so being an analyst, I figured I might as well give you two of the biggest trends that I'm seeing in eClinical solutions in the next 5-10 years. And the first one you may have heard of is decentralized trials, and the second one being patient as the consumer. And so let me define those a little bit for you. So decentralized trials, you may have heard this term before. Your friend talks about blockchain and Bitcoin, and what does that have to do with clinical trials, right? And so it is the buzzword of the day, and I love seeing it on LinkedIn. But decentralized trials, it really is just technology that enables clinical trials to be flexible in their operations in order to do things like meeting participants online, sharing information remotely. When we think of the clinical trial site as the center of operations of a clinical trial, where the participants go, where the sponsors are sending information, the decentralized trial is trying to take away not trying to take away, but they're removing the physical need for the site. And that's not to say that the site is no longer going to exist. Clinical trial sites will always exist. What it's saying is that you can do things remotely, such as consenting patients who live 2 hours away. They no longer have to drive 2 hours to the clinical trial site to get a fair, informed consent process. You can use tools like ePro, or for those who may not know, is like electronic patient reported outcomes. And so you may have the need to have your patients fill out a survey on their phone every single day in between their 2-week window in between visits, right? One of my favorite terms that I've heard into getting into clinical trials so far is what's called parking lot syndrome. And that's the idea that the day of their visit, a patient comes to their clinical trial visit, and in the parking lot, they fill out their 2-week diary, and they're like, "Oh yeah, last Thursday I was feeling okay," right? Like that's not accurate, right? So there is a need for electronic patient reported outcomes where they could get a notification on their phone that says, "Hey, you need to take your medication. It's 9 a.m. Take 1 pill now and take it with some food, and then tell me how you're feeling in 2 hours," right? So decentralized trials is really just enabling clinical trials to run more smoothly by utilizing digital technology, so you can do more things remotely. And then getting into patients are finally being seen as the consumer, right? So this is an important trend, right? Because there are so many issues in clinical trials surrounding things like low recruitment, low enrollment, diversity and representation in our clinical trials, and medication compliance. So patients are finally being included and having more of a voice in clinical trial design in their operations, right? So like I explained in that earlier example, right? Now with e-consent, we can reach a broader audience where there can be a patient who lives 2 hours away. They don't have to drive to the office, right? To come do an informed consent process. We can do that over a Zoom call. They can consent online. We can also do trial matching. I met with a company last week, BioOptronics, very interesting company. They utilize EMS data throughout 2/3 of the United States, and in real time, there can be someone who is being sent to the hospital, and they'll get that data come in. They can reach out to that hospital and say, "Hey, this person just came in with XYZ symptoms, and we think they're a perfect match for this clinical trial that you're actively recruiting for." And then when that patient gets there, gets treated, the hospital can say, "Okay, now we can reach out to them and say, hey, you could be eligible for this clinical trial." So these trends where we're starting to look at, you heard it a couple of times in the last presentation, the presentation before, is personalized medicine, looking at the patient really as the consumer. And so that's really important, and we're going to see more and more of it in the next 5 to 10 years. So how do we innovate in a space with so much red tape, right? And that's not to say that red tape is bad. It obviously has a lot of negative connotations, right? Regulations exist for a reason. Clinical trials has a history of unethical practice. And so how do you get through the change management required to be compliant in regulations? And so, I mean, these are just 4 regulatory bodies that I thought of in 3 seconds, right? And so the first 3 are US based, and the last one is Europe. Imagine launching a global trial, right, with global regulations, or not even global regulations, 200 plus countries, regulatory bodies, and individual unique regulations. And so how do you enable and innovate, right, in a space with so much regulation? So the way that I like to think about it is that regulation compliance should really be your value proposition when designing. Should really be your value proposition when innovating something like an e-clinical solution in clinical trials. So compliance really means 2 things, right? And that's building compliant systems and building compliant processes. If you have the most locked down database in the world, no one can access it remotely, but you don't have a password on your computer, then I can go on your laptop and access the database. That's not a compliant system, right? So you want to make sure that the compliant system is paired with the compliant process, and it goes vice versa as well. So when we were innovating on e-consent, what we asked ourselves is like, how can we de-risk the move for our customers to adopt e-consent, right? When we realized is we can work with sites to help get them IRB approval. And not only that, but we can help them build compliant processes to adopt e-consent themselves. And so that's when we invest in white glove service, which is just another term for having really good customer service. And that's giving customers the resources they need to help build those compliant processes. We've helped sites write SOPs to adopt processes that enable them to use our products compliantly. And the last one is focusing on customer buy-in. So buy-in not only helps customers get used to their workflows and remain compliant and no longer have to worry about, am I doing this compliantly? Is this going to get my whole site shut down or the study not go through? But it also helps them stick with the product, which is really good on the business side, right? This results in a lot of low churn, which churn is a term used to is a rate of how many people are leaving your product or service. So we have a low churn because we really focus on our users getting into the system and developing workflows with our system. And so that is how I like to think about innovating in a regulated space, is that regulation compliance can be your value proposition, because once you have those processes in place at your customer site, they are like almost hands off. It's like, okay, I am comfortable and confident in the systems and in the processes that we built and the system, that now I can get back to doing what's really important to me. And that's patient care, other clinical trial operation things. They no longer have to worry about paper, if they're going to spill coffee on their paper, or if they're going to, if the building's going to catch on fire, if that room gets a sprinkler in it, what happens to all that paper, right? So it gives them that confidence and that kind of relief if you build their processes and you build a compliant system. So now I want to get to what I like to call the clinical trial paradox, right? And so what this chart that you're seeing right here is what's called the diffusion of innovation. I think it was, I want to say 1960 is when it first came up, the social phenomenon of product adoption when a product is released. And so the people all the way on the left are what's called innovators. So when a product is released, these are the first people that go and buy that product. They're venturesome, they're interested in new ideas, and they want to test things out. And the people all the way on the right are what's called laggards. They're very skeptical of change. It's difficult for them to want to buy some sort of new technology, right? It's going to take them some time. The way a good analogy is like, think about when the iPhone was released in 2007. The hipsters that were the first people in the door, right? They hadn't heard of an iPhone before. They wanted to try it. They wanted to be the first ones to try it, as compared to someone like my grandfather who didn't get an iPhone until last year because maybe he didn't see a need for it or he didn't trust it. But that's a good analogy to understand this chart, right? And so in clinical trials, on one hand, like clinical trials are on the cutting edge of innovation, right? Like clinical trials are literally doing things like trying to cure cancer, right? Like trying to solve our biggest problems as humans in the human body. But when it comes to utilizing like cloud-based technologies, they're very laggards. Or we are very luggish, right? And that's not to say that it's the fault of people in clinical trials. The reason for this is that regulations make change in clinical trial practice difficult. And because there's difficulty to change is what makes clinical trials laggards when it comes to cloud-based workflow services, right? And so when I talk about innovating in clinical trials, I say that it's the easiest job in the world, right? Because I'm not inventing the next best thing, right? I don't have to come up with the next best technology. I'm not coming up with Facebook's Meta, whatever, if that is considered the next best thing, right? But the way I like to think about it is I'm taking technology that's been so useful in so many other industries and just applying that to clinical trials and helping shape product development using those technologies to apply it to all of the specific unique needs for clinical trials and helping the industry utilize those technologies. So what's the method? And this innovations process can be used in so many different ways. And this is why I asked at the beginning, where are you working and where are you calling in from? Because I wanted to make sure that I am able to warp this presentation so you have something to take away from it. And so this innovations process can be used, whether it's product development, whether you're trying to start a new initiative at your organization, whether you're trying to write new procedures for your organization to follow. You can take this method and apply it to that practice, right? And so it starts with research. You gotta see the whole picture, right? You gotta know all the different pieces and how they fit in together. Then you analyze those different pieces and you fit in those relationships. And then you take hypotheses from that, just the scientific method, right? You take hypotheses. And so you say, a hypothesis that I have. So the patient reported outcomes, the survey that I was talking about on the phone earlier, right? So I have a hypothesis that is a tool that only a sponsor would have a need for and would buy. And so what I will do now is I will go and test. I will interview a clinical trial site and say, hey, do you have a need for your clinical trial participants to insert data on their phone remotely for some data fields that the sponsor may not be asking for? And so that's testing that hypothesis, right? And the last thing you do is iterate. You just run that over and over and over again. And so to really drive this process, something that I've taken up at Florence is every quarter we do an innovation summit, and I invite all of you to follow me on LinkedIn, and you can get the notifications for that if you want to be a part of it. And so as part of that innovation summit, we host 200 to 400 clinical trial professionals that come to roundtable discussions, talking about things like digitizing paper processes, site for sponsored technology ownership issues, yada, yada, yada. And then from those conversations, we go back and I reach out personally to different people who attended, and I'll say, hey, will you have a one-on-one interview with me? And we'll go on, and for 45 minutes to an hour, I'll just say, hey, tell me your problems, tell me your processes, and they'll talk through and they'll do the innovating for you, right? Like I told you, I've only been in the industry for 5 months now, right? I'm not the expert. I'm learning, but I am not the expert. So it's really about talking to the people that are in the industry and testing the hypothesis that you have, like I just gave in that example. So it's really about iterating that process and having a driver to run that process over and over and over again. And so you want to make sure that what you have today is not what you have tomorrow. You want to take the good parts of what you have today, bring them to tomorrow. You want to iterate on the things that need to be fixed and do that every day so that there is an end state that you're comfortable with. And even that end state is really only what is at the present. You still want to iterate on that tomorrow. So that is a way to do it in product development. And so if you have any, if you want me to try to match this to whatever organization you're in, I would love to see it in the chat. And I can try to make that connection while I'm going through the presentation. So the biggest takeaways, and I'll try to wrap this up early. I think we are a little behind on time. So the biggest takeaways is I want you to think about being intentional with product development. You need to design with the end user in mind. New features have to be intentional on release, and it can't just be, I think this is going to work. Let's ship it, right? It needs to be intentional, and that's especially important when you're marketing and selling to laggards within an industry. The second thing is talk to the end user. Don't just imagine what you think they want. You can, in those interviews, you can ask a specific way. I talk to a lot of clinical trial sites, and something that we talk about is electronic source. And source, they'll say, I have nothing wrong with my source process, but then they tell you that it costs them $1 million a year just to house the paper that comes with all of the source documentation for their clinical trials. And so the last one is iterate. Today's product should not be tomorrow's. So those are the biggest takeaways that I want you to have. And with that, thank you for listening to my presentation. If there's any questions, please throw them in the chat. You can connect with me on Medium or LinkedIn. I do write a blog on Medium and LinkedIn where I share it about different things that I'm learning as I've gotten into the clinical trials industry, whether that's in healthcare, clinical trials, venture capital within clinical trials and healthcare. And then I also post article summaries and whatnot on LinkedIn. And then feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn as a connection or a personal email. I love to meet people one-on-one. And thank you very much.